Hey folks! Ready to unravel another spellbinding chapter in the Gretchen's Misadventures series? You're in for a magical treat. Welcome back to my channel. Today, we're diving into the mystical world of Witch's Teeth, Episode 4, in the Wayward Fairy Tale series by P.A. Mason. In this bewitching tale, join us as we follow Gretchen on yet another misadventure, where tooth fairies are up against creatures that go bump in the night. So grab your wand, pointy hat, and let's uncover the enchantment of Witch's Teeth. Witch's Teeth. Chapter 1. Gretchen winced and put a hand to her cheek. It was impossible to concentrate on what Lord Pelican was saying. His jowls wobbled, and it sounded like he had something important to say, but her tooth stole all her attention. "And this is the most vital part," Lord Pelican chimed. But even as he spoke, a fish leapt over their lily-pad table, and he darted his head out and caught it in his beak with a "Hey!" Gretchen sat bolt upright in bed with a hand to her cheek. A small fairy hovered over her bed and illuminated her bedroom. Gretchen snatched at the string in her mouth and winced as it pulled on her tooth. The fairy went to make off, but Mulligan swatted it with a paw, a transfixed look in his eye. "What in tarnation do you think you're doing?" Gretchen spat out the string and sprang out of the bed. The fairy, though winded, leaped up from her bedspread and launched into the air, avoiding Mulligan's ill-timed pounce. Before Gretchen could close the door, the fairy slipped out, and she watched as it ducked up her chimney out of sight. Gretchen winced and ran a tongue along her gum to check for damage. Aside from the taste of blood, everything seemed in order, and she turned to her feline, who sniffed around her hearth. "Fat lot of good you are," she snorted. "Why is there a fairy buzzing around trying to play dentist?" With Mulligan providing no reasonable excuse, Gretchen shrugged on her robe and set the kettle to boil with shaking hands. A nice cup of tea with a little yarrow to stop the bleeding. Gretchen stood unmoving in the middle of her kitchen. Her tooth. That fairy was about to steal her damn tooth. As she waited, she sat at the table and put her head in her hands. Sleep crept up on her, and her mind lulled. Teeth and fairies, and pelicans. The kettle whistled and brought her out of her reverie. She bustled about, lit some candles, and prepared her favourite teapot. She filled it with boiled water to let it steep, and sunk into her favourite chair by the fire, eyeing the chimney askance, lest the fairy decide to come back and finish the job. With eyes as wide as saucers, she sat in a quiet vigil until the first sounds of birdsong came from the gardens, with the dim light of dawn followed close behind it. "Estelle," she announced, standing up. "She'll tell me what's going on." Mulligan lay sprawled on her bed as she dressed. He gave a yawn and stretched at her disruption. With a muttered curse about his inferior hunting skills, she snatched her pouch from its hook and buttoned her cloak against the chilly morning. Striding out to her garden with determination, she clicked her fingers at her broom and was soon airborne, heading to the fairy godmother's house. Although only a few fields over, Estelle's house was worlds apart from Gretchen's own humble abode. Instead of medicinals and vegetables, flowers of every colour in the rainbow crowded close to her whitewashed brick walls, in bloom no matter what the season. Gretchen landed around back where she was less likely to scuff up the pristine lawn and stomped up to the back door to shake the chimes that served as a doorbell. Gretchen waited a full 3 minutes, seething, until the door opened a crack and the perpetually vague-looking fairy peered out and settled her half-moon spectacles on her nose. "Oh, is that you, Gretchen? Early for a visit, but I've not long put the kettle on." She swung the door open and pulled her shawl close around her shoulders. "I seem to have a fairy problem." Gretchen scraped her boots before she entered the cheery kitchen. "The tooth kind." "Oh?" Estelle tittered nervously and fetched 2 dainty teacups. "Can't say we mix much, us godmothers and those little creatures." "So you wouldn't have any insight as to why I had a fairy trying to give me an involuntary extraction while I slept?" Gretchen narrowed her eyes as Estelle's wing twitch gave her away. Oh dear. She readied a floral-painted tea tray and set it on the table. I guess things must be getting dire. Dire? If I'm getting assaulted in my bed in the middle of the night, I'd say they were worse than dire. What do you know? Estelle settled on a stool across from her and poured tea with a dreamy look on her face. Gretchen gritted her teeth while she waited for the aging fairy to gather her thoughts and drummed her fingers on the table. You do know what the fairies use teeth for, yes? Fairy dust. Everyone knows that, though I'll never understand why it's called fairy dust and not kiddie teeth dust. You could grind children's teeth all day and never get fairy dust, dear. It's just what the fairies use to create it. She took a sip of tea. Fairy dust powers almost everything in their realm, not to mention the price it fetches here. Beautiful forests all strung with lights. That doesn't happen all on its own, you know. I've brought my fair share of fairy dust over the years. Gretchen twirled her finger in the air. But I'm still not seeing what this has to do with my teeth. Well, of course, a witch or wizard's teeth are much more potent, but snatching those is against the inter-realm treaty. Estelle fiddled with the chain dangling from her glasses and stirred her already well-stirred tea. I'd heard there was trouble, but I hadn't imagined it was this far gone. Estelle, for the love of the light, can you speak plainly for once? Gretchen propped her head in her hands, the lack of sleep tugging at her eyelids. Fairy overpopulation, not enough teeth to go around. Gretchen opened her mouth, but found nothing to say. She blinked and tried a different tactic. Look, I don't care if there's a problem keeping the lights on over there. How do I keep that little sprite out of my home and out of my mouth? You know, I can't even think of who their representative on this plane is these days. She rubbed her chin and stared out the window. Of course it can't be Rupert. He moved on years ago, but there should be someone still in that post. Estelle, focus. Tooth fairy deterrent. Is there anything they're allergic to? Some kind of lure I could use to trap 'em? Estelle recoiled and held a hand to her chest. Oh, you can't do that, dear. They're protected under the very same treaty. They'd need to be found guilty of breaking it before our laws could dispense any justice. So, I wait until I've had a tooth pulled, gather some witnesses and take my complaint to the sheriff? Gretchen screwed her face up. And what about that time you helped me take out a molar? You wouldn't have gone and traded it to those creatures now, would you? Estelle's cheeks bloomed red, and she cleared her throat. Well, you did say you didn't want it any more. Gretchen stood, her tea untouched. Thanks for all your help. If you happen to remember who's in charge of those thieves, be sure to let me know. Estelle nodded vaguely and remained seated as Gretchen let herself out. Darn fairies. Most of them were troublemakers, but to regular folks, they were the celebrities of the magical world. She doubted Estelle would come up with anything useful, so she launched into the air at breakneck speed to find someone who could. That early in the morning, it was a 50-50 proposition on whether Gretchen could find Nora at the Salt and Bog or at the Baron's estate. She figured she'd at least get some decent coffee at the Salt and Bog, and made a beeline past the morning traffic of birds to head to the tavern. She knew Jurgen was an early riser, and the troll surprised her sometimes with unusual magical facts. She skidded down to the well-worn track behind her favourite watering hole and marched through the back into the kitchens, where Jurgen was tending the hearth. He glanced up and did a double-take as he dusted off his hands. "What's eating you?" "Freaking fairies, that's what." Gretchen heaved deep breaths and flexed her hands. The troll snorted with laughter and crossed to the counter where he had a pot of coffee already brewed. "Always something with you, isn't it? What did this one do? Turn your herbs into flowers or something?" "Worse than that. That brazen little horsefly tried to yank out my tooth in my very own bed." Jurgen swung around at that, coffee pot suspended over Gretchen's favourite mug with his mouth hanging open. "A tooth fairy? Well, I'd expect it wasn't a pixie now, wouldn't I? Those things can be nasty if you bump into them in the forest, but I'm pretty sure they aren't interested in chompers." Gretchen sank down at the table and rubbed her eyes. "Is Nora here? How do you know?" Jurgen didn't bother hiding a smirk as he brought 2 mugs to the table and sat across from her. "I think she's trying to make herself scarce around the estate." It made sense, given the fiasco with the frog. After seeing the Baron squirm when he stood accused of ordering a hex on a member of a royal family, she found it surprising he hadn't reconsidered his need for Nora's services entirely. "I'm not making myself scarce," Nora grunted, as she stumbled in from the tap room, hair plastered to her face at an alarming angle. Her spectacles looked bent from a night spent mashed into a table by the bar. "The Baron is the one who has barely been home in the past few weeks. Off to court and following the king on his procession around the countryside, no doubt kissing a few backsides. Now, what's this nonsense about fairies?" Although Gretchen recounted the entire tale along with her visit to Estelle, she wasn't convinced Nora believed her until she peered inside her mouth to squint at the inflamed gum. "Well, I'll be." She took a sip of coffee and gently lowered herself back to the bench seat. "Can't say I've ever heard of the like." "We should probably check your mouth while we're at it," Jurgen smirked. "I doubt you would have stirred had the little beast tried it on you." Nora shot him a murderous look and promptly ignored the troll. "Of course there's not a lot known about the fairy realm. Few who venture there ever return, and those that do," she tapped the side of her forehead, "are about as sharp as the average ball of wool when they get back. But if witches' teeth were all that potent, surely this would have come up before now." "I don't care what they want them for. They're not getting them. If you don't have any ideas, I'm heading home to brew some rat poison." Nora took off her spectacles to clean them with her sleeve, and her brows knitted in concentration. After patting her hair back into place, she took another gulp of coffee and set it down firmly on the table. "It's worth a look in my spell book. We can come up with a plan from there." "If they're offering free dental," Jurgen gathered the mugs and stood, "send 'em my way. I've had a molar that's been bugging me for months." "And why is this the first I'm hearing of it?" Gretchen eyed the troll askance. "Your potions taste terrible." There was humour in his eyes. "The pain isn't that bad yet." Chapter 2. "There's a lot here on pixies." Nora rubbed her chin. "But I can't see anything on tooth fairies. I guess our paths rarely cross." Gretchen sat at the far end of the room, the hairs on the back of her neck pricking as Nora inspected her spellbook. She hoped it was the magical energy responsible for the sensation. The subterranean offshoot of the dungeon housed more than its fair share of creepy crawlies. She rubbed at her grainy eyes and groaned. "See? Should have just gone home and started on the poison. Do you know at least if they can only scoot around at night? I've had barely any sleep, and I could sure use just a little shut-eye." "They're really not my forte." Nora closed her hefty tome and tied its laces back in place. "Perhaps if we went to the library, they'd have to keep something on them, surely." "I'd fall off my broom sleeping before I ever got there." Gretchen hugged her arms as she paced the room. "Any chance of getting a coffee around here? Or maybe some kind of rousing potion? If I can catch that little sucker, maybe I can figure out what it wants, and if I can expect another attack." "And what then?" Nora leaned back against her work table. "Well, I guess a sack tied tight with some heavy stones. The creek probably has enough water at this time of year to make it a pretty obvious outcome." "I mean, what will you do with that knowledge? We know next to nothing about their realm. And if your teeth are some kind of valued commodity, going over there to confront them would be stupid." "Do I look stupid? Wait, don't answer that. Do you mind going to the academy to make some inquiries? See if this is an isolated incident or if there have been other occurrences? It'll get you out of these four walls, and you might find something in the library before I need a set of wooden teeth." Nora snickered. "Come with me. You'll be safer out of that cottage and in the city. We can take turns keeping watch." It was sensible, but something gnawed at Gretchen's belly and wouldn't let go. Deep down she hoped the fairy would take another swipe, if only to gain the satisfaction of netting the darn thing and keeping it in a brass birdcage for a while. Upset a witch in her own bed, like she was some kind of easy prey. "Nope, I'm staying here. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some traps to set." Gretchen didn't wait for Nora to argue, and strode out to the morning light of the Baron's courtyard. The morning work was well underway, and she recognised a few servants scuttling about carrying heavy burdens. She narrowly avoided an encounter with Steward, and slunk past with her broom to the patch of green clear of tree branches and other take-off trip hazards. It took her 3 times to launch, however, and by the time she finally took to the air, she did so with grass-stained knees and a tender ankle. The flight should have cooled her off, it usually did, but the closer she got to the cottage, the more indignant she became, and she wagered her teeth would come out of their own accord if she kept grinding them. When she pushed her front door open, She was almost disappointed when nothing seemed to be amiss. "Mulligan?" Gretchen stuck her head into her bedroom and found the feline more or less as she left him. "Glad to see you're keeping a close watch on developments. You sure all your teeth are still in that sleepy head of yours?" He graced her with a stretch and a yawn, then curled into a ball with a paw over his face. Not that she expected any better. He wasn't inclined to shame. On her way to get the cauldron lit, she hesitated by her rug in the living room. If Nora's spellbook didn't know how to get rid of a tooth fairy, she doubted hers would yield much. But sometimes her tome would cough up fragments of genius. Gretchen was dubious about whether it was intentional or pure dumb luck. With a shake of her head, she fetched the book out of its hiding place under her floorboards and carried to her desk. It gave off a hum of excitement as she undid its laces and sprang open just as she tugged the bonds free. "Chirpy this morning, eh? Where were you last night when I needed you?" Gretchen bit her tongue. It was never a good idea to torment the volume before getting what she needed. "Don't suppose you know anything about fairies?" Instead of words, illustrations spread across the page and over the spine depicting a picture-perfect forest strung with lights between the branches. "Yup, those are the ones. Now how does one put down a tooth fairy? Rat poison? Moth powder? Is there any kind of lure that might tickle their fancy?" The book recoiled, scudding backwards and flapping its pages. "Squeamish, is it? Then tell me what they want with my teeth, seeing as you know so much about them." Rather than calming the skittish spellbook, its pages went from flapping to quivering. The next drawing came in fits and starts. It was darker, sinister, though it looked like the same forest. Instead of cheery lights, sharp angles spread almost like crystal ropes in every direction, forming a complex web. Gretchen stared at it long after the drawing was complete, and despite only eliciting more questions, could find none she wanted the answers to. "Poison," she said, and slammed the book shut. "And some good old-fashioned rat traps. Maybe some fly tape, too. I'll bet those critters don't want to get those dainty wings caught up in that." Before Gretchen got started on her most common poison, which she did a decent trade with in town, she swung her kettle over the hearth and stifled a yawn. It hadn't yet passed noon, and although sleep called to her, she refused to put her feet up until she had some insurance on her dental security. At least she had all the supplies she needed on hand. There were a few customers who'd be snippy that she didn't get to the city's marketplace to set up her usual stall, but she was fortunate to be in a position where she could take the odd day off if she needed to. Rather than unlocking her pantry, she unhooked her pouch from her belt and set it on her table. She'd been meaning to get around to having another cellar dug out the back, but her infinity pouch had made things less urgent. She undid its laces, and when she stretched it open, she wrinkled her nose up at the smell. Ugh! She screwed her eyes shut. She'd forgotten the hides she was meant to take over to the leathersmiths. It was a monthly arrangement she was beginning to regret. It took almost the entire month to clear the stench before her next delivery was due. If she'd been thinking when she was at Nora's, she would have asked her friend to take the pouch with her. Gretchen rubbed the bridge of her nose. First problem first, snaring fairies and a decent nap. She'd gotten a better handle on multitasking since setting up her stall in the city, and could comfortably arrange 3 smaller cauldrons over the fire while preparing the next brew. Not that she could be sure, but she thought her potion skills were getting better, now that she had regular practice, not to mention the coin to buy supplies. Although she cringed every time she passed by her tangled medicinal garden, her newfound industry more than made up for her busy schedule. Perhaps she could hire a lad to come by and do some gardening every few weeks. With her brews bubbling along nicely, she dusted off her hands and went to phase 2 of the plan. Ordinarily, she didn't bother with trapping vermin around the house. Their limbs didn't yield much magical worth. But she was sure there was a trap or 2 in the spare room, piled up with Great Aunt Esme's old junk. She still hadn't the heart to rifle through it all, but she heaved a deep breath and opened up the musty room. Emerging with a couple of traps and a decorative wicker bird cage, she dabbed at her eyes with her sleeve and dropped them on the kitchen table to check on her potions. By the thickness, they were close to done, and she used heavy tongs to lift the cauldrons from the fire to cool by the window. With one last cup of coffee, she rigged her bedroom with sticky strips of linen from the rafters and pillows stuffed under her covers. She stood back to admire her handiwork and tapped her mouth with a finger. No sensible creature would stray into that smell without their hackles raised. Blinking her grainy eyes, she trudged back to her kitchen to work one more charm. Pine fresh wasn't a hard smell to manage, and she hoped it was the secret source of luring an unsuspecting tooth fairy. Along with a few chimes hung up to alert her to intruders, she gave them a jingle and planted her fists on her hips. "Not bad, eh, Mulligan?" She glanced around for her familiar, who'd evacuated the bed in a huff once the smell got too bad. "Where'd you get to, furball?" He sat next to his food dish in the kitchen and offered a long-suffering look. Gretchen fetched him some gizzards and milk. "Now don't let your belly get you too complacent. We've got a busy night ahead of us." Under no illusion that she could stay up all night, she fetched her lukewarm coffee and sank into her favourite armchair. She put her feet up on the coffee table and wriggled into a more comfortable position. The open bedroom door was in easy sight. The last of the afternoon sunlight streamed in through the window, and Gretchen let her droopy eyes close for a quick nap before the party started. Chapter 3. The chimes were nothing compared to the squeals. Gretchen flew up from her armchair in the dark, and cold coffee spilled down her dress. In a few quick strides she was in her bedroom, where the only light came from a glowing sprite tangled in a web of sticky strips. "Aha!" Gretchen waggled her finger. "Gotcha strung up this time, you little cretin." Mulligan held a paw up to swat at the tangle, the smell forgotten in the mystical glow. Gretchen fetched the birdcage and got a good hold on the fairy before she plucked it free. It twitched and squirmed, and Gretchen thought it might have bitten her finger as she crammed it in its wicker prison. "Let me out!" it squeaked, shaking the wicker bars. "You've made your point." Gretchen carried her winged captive to the kitchen and dropped the cage on the table. She lit some candles and hung a fresh kettle over the fire while the fairy threw a tantrum. When she set down a tea tray and settled on a stool, she smirked to see the cage knocked on its side. "Having fun in there?" Gretchen poured herself a cup. "You can't keep me in here. It's against the treaty." It rolled the cage toward her, and Gretchen righted it again. "The treaty! The same one I'm told prohibits the harvest of witches' teeth, because I'd say we're more than square on that account." The fairy sagged and leaned against its enclosure. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't desperate." "Not enough kiddie teeth to go around in fairyland?" Gretchen smacked her lips. "You critters ever considered going into the dental game? Dentists might not be popular, but at least people ask them to pull their teeth out." "I need witches' teeth." The fairy crossed her arms with a sullen look. "And there's no way to acquire one legitimately." Gretchen took a sip of tea and considered the grumpy sprite. She shouldn't care, not after the tooth-pulling stunt, but something about the haunted look at its eye appealed to her. A shred of guilt bloomed in her belly. "You should be turning green and shrivelling as we speak, impervious to poison or something." "Other than the stench," she huffed, "your potions don't bother me at all. We are beings of magic, after all." Gretchen made a mental note of that and awarded herself brownie points for thinking of the fly tape. "So, first things first. What's your name?" The fairy took her time to answer. "Tula." "Right," Gretchen nodded. "So, Tula, tell me what's with the late-night visits." Her face crumpled at that, and she drew her knees up to hide her face. "They have my children." Gretchen blinked, unsure how to respond. "The only way I'll get them back is if I procure a witch tooth. Otherwise I'll never see them again." The image the spellbook had conjured stirred in Gretchen's mind. She had a sour feeling in her gut, and she almost silenced Tula's yammering. "Our portals are naturally in the sky, but they enter the world through caverns of the deep. Not many witches to be had down there, but—" "What did you say about caves?" Gretchen yanked the cage closer and pressed her nose up against it. "The giant spiders, of course. They might be able to reach the sky with those webs of theirs, but they can't truly fly. Not much for the light either. Why did you think we keep our forest lit up? But to keep spinning their webs, they need potent magic, and nothing is more powerful than teeth, I can assure you." Gretchen tuned out, her thoughts wandering to Great-Aunt Esme and her disappearance in the caves. Try as she might, she never found any evidence of her demise. And if these portals led to the fairy realm, do they keep them? The witches, I mean. Tula looked startled for a moment and clicked her teeth shut. She considered the question with a frown. Well, sure, if they can get their claws into them. A whole witch would be sure to keep them in their silk for years. If they were clever, they'd keep such a prisoner alive to milk them for all they're worth. Do you know of any? Prisoners? Tula frowned. I don't think you understand. We keep clear of them lest we get tangled in one of their webs and become silk fodder. That's exactly what I feared when Angus and Tilly went missing. I thanked my lucky stars when one of those beasts made demands instead. Gretchen felt numb from head to toe, certain that this was the missing piece of the puzzle that had plagued her in the years since Aunt Esme had vanished. Everyone else had given up, moved on, grieved their loss. But with no closure, there had always been a spark of hope buried in Gretchen's mind. You take me there, be my guide, and I'll get your kids back. Gretchen swallowed. Are you mad? Tula's glow flared and then settled. A wash of emotions played over her face. If I take you there, you'll never return. If you want to help me, just let me take a tooth. This isn't about you, Tula. She took a sip of tea with shaking hands. I've had someone dear to me missing for years, lost in a cave. Tula blanched at that and chewed her lip. They both sat in an eerie silence for a few minutes. I'll do anything for my children. If you're foolhardy enough to give them the whole pie when they only asked for a slice, that's on you. Gretchen nodded absently, her mind still a million miles away. Foolhardy was what she was good at, and it mostly worked out in the end. If the worst happened, at least she could say in good conscience that she had tried her best to give her aunt peace. Tell me what you know about these spiders. It turned out to be very little, except that they were the apex predator in their realm. Giant spiders came with giant webs, the kind that were almost impossible to break through. Their citadel, a shining fortress, had been there as long as the fairies kept records. And what are their weaknesses? What puts them down? Gretchen leaned forward with interest, her head propped in her hands. If we knew that, we wouldn't live in fear of them. Tula raised her dainty eyebrows. You mind letting me out of here now, or are you planning to keep me in this cage until we cross over the fairy realm? While she couldn't be sure if she could trust Tula not to take a swipe at her mouth and run, she was confident she could at least fend her off. She opened the latch and pried the wicker door loose. Cages, Tula muttered. The pinnacle of cruelty to those with wings. You know I let every poor bird out when I do my rounds. We're supposed to leave them be, but I can't sit by and just let it happen. A smirk tugged at Gretchen's lips. I never much cared for keeping birds, and the only owl in our family was firmly in Aunt Esme's camp. He visited her most nights. Tula beat her wings as she stepped onto the table and pushed off into the air. She remained hovering and stretched her limbs as she rolled her neck. You said lights. That's why you keep your city strung up with those fairy lights. Enchanted light will keep them at bay, Tula nodded. But in great numbers. Their webs glow a bluish colour, so it mustn't be lethal. Gotcha. Gretchen pushed to her feet and turned to her living room to fetch her spellbook. She may not have wanted answers before, but she sure did now. And if the book knew enough to cough up a picture of that forest, it should have some answers on how to blow up Spider City. Paying no mind to Tula, who hovered over her shoulder, she dropped the book on the table and fumbled with its laces. When she pried it loose, she tapped on the cover impatiently. I'm ready to talk creepy spider forests now. Gretchen frowned at the tome, which seemed completely inanimate. You who? Anyone home? She tried to open it, but it remained stubbornly closed. So, this is how witches record their magic. Tula flew a circuit and settled on the windowsill. Seems an odd way to catalogue information. Nobody but a witch can unlock its secrets. She pressed her lips together. And sometimes even that takes some doing. Unused to having a mute spellbook, she drew a sharp breath through her nose and gave it a tickle. When it didn't so much as twitch, she balled her fists and stomped her foot. Fine, be like that. She left the volume to its own devices while filling a fresh teapot and considering what spells she already knew. Enchanted light was simple, but she'd never had cause to weaponize it before. She could start with creating some more light charms, and hopefully by then the book might have woken up from its strange slumber. Dawn isn't far away. Tula dropped onto the table, wringing her hands. I must be back by the time the first rays come over the horizon. How long do you have? Gretchen turned to her store cupboard and unlocked it with a key from her belt. "Tonight," her voice cracked. "If I go back with nothing again, my children are done for." Gretchen reached for a pair of pliers she kept hung inside the door. Turning, she waggled it in front of the fairy and held out her other hand. This was going to hurt. Taking a good grip on one of her fingernails, she gritted her teeth and yanked. Gretchen wasn't sure if it was her own shrieking or the fairy's, or maybe even both. She tucked her injured hand into her armpit and proffered the bloody fingernail clamped on the end of the pliers. "That should get you through another night," Gretchen squeaked. With a grimace, Tula wrenched the nail free and held it at arm's length. Producing a tiny net, which seemed to be the source of the glow, she enveloped the nail and secured it to her glimmering belt. She swallowed as she looked up at Gretchen. "I'll be back tonight." Gretchen gave a nod and watched Tula zip up the chimney and out into the night. People chastised her enough about her propensity to impulsiveness, but she'd like to see anyone else yank their own fingernails out with less than a second of deliberation. Her whole hand throbbed, and she didn't relish the idea of spending the next day putting her hands to use brewing corrosive potions, but there was a fire in her belly now, and an irrational certainty that her harebrained idea would lead her to answers. Fetching out some gauze and a healing salve, she bandaged her finger and set to work. Chapter 4. "What do you call this, then?" Nora swept her eyes across her kitchen, strewn with ingredients and bottles. "And what have you done to your finger?" Gretchen blinked at the mess. With only a few hours of sleep over the past 2 days, her only thought had been to keep busy and to poke her spellbook every once in a while. "Didn't catch the fairy, I assume?" "Oh, I caught her all right." Gretchen refilled her kettle and hung it over the hearth. "We have a deal, she and I. Tonight I skip over to their realm and squish some giant spiders." Nora moved with the deliberate care one would show toward the mentally unstable and lowered herself to a chair. "Come now, how about you just tell me what was in that brew?" Gretchen cleared off the table and frowned at her friend. "What do you mean? I mean, the poisons didn't work, but I had the good sense to rig up some fly tape. The no-dose brew? Those are tricky at best, and if you don't get them quite right..." Gretchen burst into fits of giggling, and the realization that it made her sound more unhinged just spurred her on. She clutched her belly and held the table for support as she bent almost double. "Okay, let's just sit you down here, and I'll brew some tea to take you down a few pegs." Nora held a comforting hand to Gretchen's back and eased her up by the elbow. "Stop!" Gretchen spluttered between giggles. "Coffee, just too much coffee." "Sure, and I promise it will be regular tea." There was an edge to Nora's voice that spoke of losing her patience. "You don't understand." Gretchen dropped to a stool. "I caught little Tula last night, and I know why she wants my teeth." Gretchen managed to school her face to calm and tried for a contrite look. "Well, where is the little imp, then?" Nora cast around for any sign of the fairy. "It's a long story." Gretchen swallowed, sobered. Nora listened attentively as she prepared a pot of tea, and her brows only knitted closer as the story went on. "So these spiders use magical beings as some kind of fuel for their silk? That's the most absurd thing I've ever heard." "Caves, Nora, think about it. She could still be there. She was a wily old thing, and if anyone could survive spider captivity, it's Aunt Esme." Nora slapped the table with her palm and pointed a finger in Gretchen's nose. "You're being ridiculous, you hear me? Planning to go gallivanting off into danger on some hopeless whim that you'll rescue a witch long dead? Now I've listened to my fair share of your theories and notions of foul play, but this..." "It's not ridiculous!" Gretchen stood, her cheeks burning. "The fates brought that fairy to my doorstep for a reason, and..." A thump from her living room caught both their attention, and they stared at Gretchen's spellbook laying spine downward on the floor. "Finally," Gretchen muttered as she wandered over. "Leaving your book to its own devices, I see. That's worse than foolhardy. Now I don't believe for a second that you didn't take anything, so just tell me what it was." Gretchen poked the spellbook with her boot gingerly, ignoring her friend's tirade. When the tome didn't show any sign of movement, she scooped it up and laid it out on her desk. "Show me again," she whispered. The forest scene looked no less sinister the second time around, and Gretchen swallowed at the implications. She didn't notice Nora hovering over her shoulder until she spoke. Good grief. Now how would a spellbook like yours know something like that? And most of the time it can't even get a stain removal charm right. Gretchen gave a nervous giggle. Without direction, the scene on the pages faded, and an inky swirl replaced it. Drumming up what courage she had, Gretchen cleared her throat. How does one take out a giant spider? The book hummed, vibrating the desk underneath, ink swirling furiously on the page. Gretchen gripped the side of her desk and waited with bated breath for something to happen. Nora's fingers clawed into her shoulders and she counted her heartbeat. 1, 2, 3. The spell book shrieked and a burst of light shone from its pages. After blinking a few times, Gretchen made out the writing as the light faded. Well, I'll be, Nora whispered. That's some powerful magic. Gretchen studied the list of ingredients and instructions, trying to piece it together. As far as practical application, it left a lot to interpretation, and this spell was vaguer than most. A light bomb, but that kind of composition suggests electricity, maybe lightning. Gretchen, Nora's voice wavered. This kind of sorcery is beyond dangerous. Even brewing it would have your magic license revoked before you could say abracadabra. Good thing I won't be using it in this realm, then. She picked up her quill and jotted down the spell carefully, not wanting to miss a single word. The spell book seemed happy to oblige for once, and the words remained fixed even after she finished making a copy. When she gently tied the book's laces and turned to put it back in its resting spot, she came face to face with Nora, who had a hand over her mouth, her cheeks drained. There was a shine in her eye that looked awfully lot like tears, and Gretchen raised her eyebrows. I always knew you'd meet your end in some mad fashion, but I'd hoped that would be years away, she swallowed. I should have you committed to the witches' home for the permanently befuddled. But instead you're going to help me brew this concoction so at least I won't blow myself up before I get there. A slight smile tugged at her lips. Nora squeezed her eyes shut with a grimace and gave a tight nod. Yes, I suppose I am. Pushing aside the light charms Gretchen had put together, they heaved out Gretchen's largest cauldron from under the counter and hefted it onto the table. With Nora looking at the notebook, she pointed toward the cellar and called out for ingredients, pushing her spectacles further up her nose. Gretchen counted her lucky stars that she had most of the items on hand, but when Nora called out for the last element, she puffed her cheeks out and sagged. I don't have any dried fireflies. But, Nora swung around to her, they're hardly rare. I'm surprised you had a dragon scale on hand. Gretchen wasn't in a position to tell Nora about her old, draconic friend Vera, and how his scratching post in Mandel's barn had yielded a tidy sum of the valuable items. I use the last of them in my light charms. Most of my brews don't call for them usually. How about we substitute a little... Hush, Nora held up her hand. You won't get away with being creative with this kind of spell. It's no wonder you haven't blown yourself up before now with all the tinkering you do. But where am I going to get a firefly at this hour? Gretchen glanced out the window where the afternoon sun hung heavy in the west. Nora scrubbed a hand over her face. Beside the prospect of tramping through the woods with a net hoping to come across one, there's only one more option. Conjuring? Gretchen's eyebrows climbed her forehead. And you think I'm the rash one? It's a practice I'm familiar with, and assuming one doesn't conjure more dangerous creatures, it falls somewhere in the grey area of the rule books. Gretchen opened her mouth to argue, but couldn't see any other solution. The one time she tried to conjure a bat, what came through the portal was a monstrous exaggeration. It had scared her off from further attempts. The green goop that exploded out of it had taken months to clean up. Well, I guess, but there's no way of knowing if it will compromise the potion any more than a light charm would. Nora pressed her lips together and drew a deep breath through her nose. I'm confident in my skill. Fetch me some chalk, will you? Gretchen tried to keep from pacing as Nora sketched out runes on her flagstone floor. She bunched her fists in her skirts, the sense of urgency warring with the aversion she had to opening portals to unknown realms. A firefly. Knowing her luck, something closer to a fire-breathing bird would tear its way through. As Nora settled into place, the light in the room began to wane, and Gretchen had to check the windows to be sure she wasn't imagining it. The power Nora called on had sapped the energy right out of the air. She sat cross-legged in front of her markings, with eyes closed. It looked almost peaceful except for the lines around her eyes. The prickling of her neck was enough for Gretchen, and she withdrew to her bedroom to gather her things for the trip. With an infinity pouch, there was no excuse to get caught without a fresh pair of underthings, and Gretchen's eyes boggled. The hides. Careful not to disrupt Nora's mutterings and wincing against the raw power building in her cottage, she opened her pouch and braced for the smell. Cursing herself for not making the effort into putting a decent perishing ward before she'd stuffed them in, she let herself quietly out the back door and pulled the rolled skins out onto her lawn. She could have Nora arrange the delivery, maybe with a note explaining that she may not be back next month, or the month after. Leaving the pouch untied to let the void air out, she pushed her back door open into a swarm. "What in tarnation?" Gretchen battered at the flies that almost buzzed up her nose. "How many do you conjure?" A sucking wind tugged at her limbs and rattled Gretchen's home in a frenzy. She heard a vase shatter and fought against the pull of the vortex hovering above Nora's markings. The insects whistled back through the portal, and when it snapped shut, everything mid-air dropped to the floor. "Oh dear." Nora sucked in deep breaths, her hands braced on her knees. That got a little out of hand. A picture frame slid down the wall with a clatter. A little? I'm not sure I could have beat this mess if I tried. And for what? Did we even get any of those critters? The herbs strewn across the kitchen were in a complete mess, and Mulligan emerged, shaking from under the sofa. When he spotted Gretchen, he hissed with accusation and sped toward the bedroom. "I think—" Nora bent to the floor. "Yes, there's a few here. A dragonfly too. Not sure how I managed that." "Right." Gretchen pursed her lips as she surveyed the damage. "Well, if we've any chance of getting this potion done before my ride gets here, we better set this kitchen right, straight away." Nora gave a nod. "I'll put the fireflies in the back of the hearth to dry. I don't suppose you have a charmed broom?" The pair set to work collecting and sifting through the herbs and other ingredients, along with shattered ceramics in their path. They didn't bother with the rest of the house, and Gretchen hauled out her mortar and pestle to begin grinding. With Nora in charge of the scales, every measure was as close as it could be to perfect, and she added each item gingerly to the gently simmering cauldron. As it came together in a gloppy mess, an acrid steam wafted from the hearth, and they tied wet scarves around their mouths to save their throats from burning. "The flies are last." Nora bit her lip as she fetched them from the brick shelf at the back of the hearth with long tongs. "I can't say what would happen if things go wrong, but I have a feeling they won't be pretty." Gretchen glanced out of her darkened windows and puffed her cheeks out. "I don't have any choice. If you want to leave now, at least I'll only be blowing myself up." Nora's eyes darted, considering the offer, but she shook her head and sighed. "I said I was confident in my skill. I'll stand by the statement." She dropped the dried flies into Gretchen's palm and nodded toward the hearth. "You can do the honour." With a deep breath, Gretchen took Nora's hand and stepped towards the bubbling brew. Throwing a silent prayer out into the ether, she held her hand out and let the flies drop into the cauldron. Light exploded out of the hearth, along with a high-pitched squalling. Chapter 5. "Well, you could have used the door like a normal person." Gretchen fought the smirk threatening to take over her cool composure. Tula glared below singed eyebrows and flapped her scorched wings. "We prefer loftier entrances." Nora scooped the last of the gelatinous mess into one of Gretchen's larger potion bottles and pushed a cork in carefully. "Could have been worse. So how did you go with old 8 legs?" Gretchen hefted the cauldron toward the sink. "The beast is not happy," Tula swallowed. "Says if I don't come back tonight with a tooth, it will drain my children dry." "Well, good thing we have a super spell on hand. I don't know how my spell book knows about your realm, but I've never been more confident in its advice." Gretchen watched the fairy hug her arms, eyes creased with worry. She crossed to the table and sunk to a stool to meet her eye to eye. "Now listen. That creepy Crawley sent you here to collect one tooth. Instead, you're bringing the whole enchilada. If he takes me, well, that's my own fault, and you get your kids back. If he doesn't hand them over, then he never intended to." Gretchen licked her lips. "But if I bust that web right open, I promise I'll make it my first priority to get those baby buzzards of yours back safe." Tula sniffled and dabbed at her eyes. "Just some second thoughts, you know. It'd be easier if you'd just give me a tooth." "Come now." Nora turned on her grandmotherly smile and joined them at the table. "With the two of us to take on these monsters, we stand a good chance of ridding your realm of their presence entirely." "Two of us?" Gretchen's head whipped toward Nora. "Now hold up just a minute. I appreciate the help with the potion, but you're not coming with me." "No?" Nora raised her eyebrows. "And how far do you think you'll get on your own?" "This isn't your problem, Nora. I don't expect you to go running into danger on my account." "And the time you helped me out of the Frog Prince jam?" Nora leaned back in her chair, bracing for an argument. "That was nothing compared to this. Besides, I've got errands for you to run, and if I don't come back, then you must alert the guilds about all this. You know what they're like. Debate about the likelihood for a few centuries, and then poke around in the archives. There might be a chance of an expedition before the millennia is out." Nora fixed her jaw and crossed her arms in front of her. "You really expect me to sit this out?" Gretchen's shoulders sagged and she stared up at the ceiling. "If I don't get those hides over to the leathersmiths, so help me, it won't be worth the trip back. They'll turn me into a witch satchel. And if I don't come back, well, I'd rather people know what happened." That seemed to touch a nerve, and Nora's eyes softened. She had been Gretchen's rock since Aunt Esme's disappearance and understood the lack of closure had been harder than the grief itself. "Just be careful on that broom of yours." Nora pushed to her feet and began tidying the kitchen. "If you're zooming through those webs, you're likely to end up clotheslining yourself." Gretchen smirked and turned to Tula, who looked just as worried as before. "Chin up! I promise to yank one of my own teeth out if I mess this up." Tula gave a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We should go if you plan on getting to the heart of their citadel before I'm due." Gretchen nodded and rounded up her things with an absent scratch behind Mulligan's ear. The feline had found his way back into her bedroom, apparently deciding the smell in there wasn't as bad as the commotion in the rest of the house. Her throat was tight as he gave a sleepy purr, and she tried to keep her thoughts from what would become of her scruffy friend if she got turned into spider silk. Nora may not be fond of cats, but he and Jürgen got along well. "You ready?" Nora stood on the threshold fiddling with her spectacles. "All set." Gretchen plastered on a cheery smile and rolled her spare clothes in a bundle small enough to pass through the opening of her infinity pouch. After strapping as many regular light charms as she could on her belt and pointed hat, she eased the light bomb into her pouch and gave her friend a hug. "I'll be back soon." "You better be." Nora gave her a squeeze and sniffed as she let go. Tula took that as her cue and sprang off from the table, hovering around the front door. "The portal is at a rather high altitude, I'm afraid. I hope your broom will carry you that far." "So do I," Gretchen muttered as she stepped into the night. She wasn't sure if it was the sense of urgency, the presence of the fairy, or just dumb luck, but her broom was perfectly cooperative as she took off from the bare patch on her lawn. The night was brisk, but dry at least, and she was surprised at the pace little Tula kept up as she flew ever higher. It figured these portals were above the regular flying altitudes. Gretchen had the kind of luck that meant she would have encountered one before now if they lurked lower. Wind stung at her eyes as they pushed on, and the dry air was becoming moist as they passed the first wisps of clouds. Flight was normally invigorating. She wasn't sure if it was the air pressure or the minimal amount of sleep, but she felt battered instead of refreshed. Keeping a firm hold on the shuddering broom handle, she leaned down to lower resistance and kept Tula in sight. There was a shimmering beyond her, though it could have been a trick of her watering eyes, and when they approached, the night sky seemed to brighten. Gretchen's ears popped as they crossed into the portal, and the darkness transformed to an illuminated canopy. Tula dived straight into the wall of leaves, and Gretchen veered just in time to avoid a treetop landing. Turning circles and blinking to get her bearings, Gretchen couldn't see a clear spot to land. The skyscape was a queer shade of purple, which brightened to pink closer to the lights. There was no sign of a moon hanging in the sky, and the air was warm, almost sticky. Tula buzzed into her line of sight and zipped back to the trees. Gretchen followed her path down to a white strip across the canopy, which on closer inspection was a length of canvas tied across the uppermost branches. Screwing her face up at the likelihood of a crash landing of epic proportions, she slowed her vehicle with her heels thrust down and her arms wrenching the handle upward. It wasn't as bad as she thought, and even as she rolled, head over boots, she felt a wave of relief before dropping onto the sheet and quite possibly cracking her rib on a branch underneath. "Quickly!" a high-pitched voice hissed. "Undo the ties." Her makeshift hammock shifted and lowered, rolling Gretchen into a tangle and jolting as it scraped past branches. Her broom handle poked her in the eye, and all she could do to keep from being assaulted was rolling into a ball until it was over. After crashing through what she imagined was every branch on the way to the bottom, her rump hit something solid. Before she could catch her breath enough to flail, angry shouts came from all around and Gretchen strained to hear what they were saying. "Is the meaning of all this? What did you bring back, Tula?" Clearly, Tula hadn't cleared her arrival with Tooth Fairy HQ. Gritting her teeth against the pain, Gretchen kicked at the heavy folds to get free. "They have my Angus and Tilly. I don't care what the treaty says. If you think I'll stand by—" Gretchen wrenched herself free and stood with a groan. The forest floor had turned to silence, and Gretchen blinked at the swarm of fairies buzzing about. Bending to retrieve her broom, she cleared her throat and winced at the sharp pain in her ribs. "I can assure you, I'm here of my own free will." The words set off a cacophony of shouting and screeching, the words too fast and shrill for Gretchen to catch. The buzzing in her ear from the frantic beating of wings didn't help either, and she leaned against a tree trunk trying to take stock of her injuries. She decided her rib was probably bruised as she probed through her shirt. The poke in the eye had already produced some impressive swelling, and the tender spots on her rump and limbs were bruises rather than gashes. The canvas looked like it hadn't sustained so much as a rip, and she wondered how often they had visitors to their realm. She made a note to suggest a landing strip of some description to save some poor wretch from the same fate. Holding her injured finger, which had kicked off a fresh wave of throbbing, she narrowed her eyes at the fairies, who showed no sign of slowing down their quick-fire war of words. "Do you think," she interrupted, "there's any danger of offering a poor battered witch some hospitality? A cup of tea, maybe a cold compress for her eye?" They stared at her, their argument forgotten, like she was some kind of freak show. A greenish fairy fluttered closer and looked her up and down. "We take her to Gretchen. He'll decide what to do with her." Gretchen looked at Tula, whose eyes shone with anguish. A companion held an arm around her shoulder. Things weren't getting off to a good start. I'm actually here on business, so you'll have to pass along my apologies to this Gretchen of yours. You know the deal. Spiders to see and kiddies to rescue. Tell you what, if all goes to plan, I'll be back in time for the celebratory feast. I hear you fairies make a mean liquor and— Net her. The green fairy folded her arms, and the others, who looked like guards, now Gretchen thought of it, surged forward with little spears. She wasn't sure how the tiny nets strung to their belts came to entangle her, but they were soon wrapped tight around her torso. There was little give in them, though they seemed stretched from the fine mesh Tula used for her fingernail. A sharp poke between her shoulder blades made her squawk, and she took a step forward. "I trust you will cooperate." The leader of the guards smirked, though there was no humour in her eyes. Gretchen did her best imitation of a curtsy, trussed up as she was, and flashed a sardonic smile. "Well, of course, such a warm welcome. Take me at once to your toothy leader." Gretchen tramped over the forest floor, ignoring the pained looks on the fairies' faces as she disrupted the delicate underbrush. Their people would have heard her heading toward them a mile away, yet nobody met them along the path to a brightly lit clearing. The lights suspended over the trees didn't look like any kind of light Gretchen was used to. She couldn't see anything at their core, and rather than strung across on string, they bobbed up and down in mid-air. After a while of craning her head toward the upper reaches of the trees, she began noticing the first flutters of movements. "Tree houses, eh?" The pixies back home are partial to a tree, but you'll find them burrowing under the roots instead. They don't seem to mind the dark like—" Another poke silenced her, and she rolled her eyes. The trees seemed larger as they continued and showed more signs of habitation. Small carved windows dotted the trunks and woven platforms spanned across branches. Gretchen's eyes strained at the brightness, and she wondered when dawn would break. She had no idea how these creatures ever got any sleep. They came to a stop in front of a tree that seemed larger than the others, its massive roots keeping Gretchen at a distance from the trunk itself. Scuffling sounds came from windows above, and tiny heads peered down at their party with a buzz of excited whispers. A single fairy emerged from the uppermost reaches and swooped down to meet them. His glow was more muted than the others, and his wizened face crinkled in a suspicious stare as he came nose to nose with Gretchen. "I'm guessing you must be Gretchen?" Chapter 6. You would risk the treaty itself and put our entire populace at risk. Gretchen glared at Tula, though the effort seemed wasted as she kept her eyes firmly on her feet. If we cannot keep the lights on, what good does it do to get young Angus and Tilly back? Tula trembled, though with terror or fury Gretchen couldn't say. Her cheeks burned bright red, and she held her fists clenched at her side. Look, back home we're hard-pressed to even remember who is in charge of this treaty. I hadn't heard of it myself before a few nights ago. Gretchen seated herself on an accommodating tree root and glanced up at the audience who hovered above them. To say they were in a clearing was generous, but the sheer size of the trees meant that they stood spaced further than the forest she had crashed through. All's we know over there is that you fairies sneak over and collect our kids' teeth and leave them presents, and that fairy dust is hideously expensive. I mean, if you want to keep lights on, I can think of spells which call for far more humble ingredients. Gretchen blinked, losing her train of thought. The treaty has stood for millennia. Gretchen's reedy voice carried an impressive amount of authority, despite its tenor. And it is the only portal left open to us. We cannot risk the ire of your realm. Well, you caught my ire, let me tell you, yanking teeth out of a poor woman's mouth. Gretchen clicked her teeth shut, checking herself as Tula's head whipped towards her. But never mind that. I made a promise to Tula here to rid your world of these creepy crawlies for good. There was a gasp that came from the crowd, and the forest tuned to silence. Gretchen glanced up to be sure the fairies hadn't skedaddled and fumbled at her pouch to retrieve the light bomb. She eased it out and held it with both hands. The yellow blob inside glowed under the fairy lights, and the silence turned to whispers. You propose to do battle with the Arachne? Gretchen's face was rigid, and his words seemed controlled. They who use your ilk for their own power. Call it restorative justice, for every witch who met her end at the bottom of a cave. She pointedly ignored the tension in the air. If you critters had told us about all this, maybe we would have taken care of it long before now. Gretchen snapped his fingers overhead, and Gretchen looked up to see their audience buzz away. Tula went to spring off from a tree root, but halted at a warning look from their leader. Gretchen scanned the remaining fairies, all guards, and gave a satisfied nod. It was your kind who insisted on that particular clause. His eyes flickered to Gretchen. Else the whole deal would have been off. Gretchen puzzled over that. She'd never been much interested in witch politics or keeping up with interrealm policy. Heck, she'd never even been abroad in her own world. Her sister Cordelia would know, but then, if she'd had an inkling about what Gretchen's plans were, she would have detained her for the foreseeable future. But she couldn't fathom why these spiders hadn't been dealt with properly. Surely the upper echelons knew what was happening with these witch disappearances involving caves. The document is probably mouldering in some forgotten archive. Gretchen waved her hand. And I promise not to squish and tell. Let me torch this spider city, rescue some captives and slip back home. Gretchen laughed, which was strangely loud from his slight form. You have no idea what you're up against. We tread lightly around the Arachne, a whole magical race. You are one witch with a potion. Take your broom and leave this place before you get yourself killed or worse. It was tempting, the more Gretchen thought about it. But a cold fury grew in her belly as she contemplated what her sister knew about this realm, about what could have happened to their great aunt. She was quick to tell Gretchen to move on, stamped out any suggestion that she might one day return, or that they could recover her remains and give her a decent burial. She glanced at Tula, who was silently weeping, already grieving her lost children. "I've never been accused of being sensible, I'm afraid. What's the worst that can happen? I meet my demise and can't head back to my realm to tattle on you. Life goes on." Gretchen tucked the potion back in her pouch. "My spell book knew enough to have me brew this concoction. It's been handed down for generations. If you don't trust me to take them out, maybe the accumulated wealth of the Mirkwood family knowledge might sway you." There was a flicker of recognition in Gretchen's eye, gone before Gretchen was sure what to make of it, and he took a deep breath. "Tula, if you want to accompany this witch to her end, I won't stand in your way." He sprang from the ground with a litheness that belied his weathered features. The guards took off behind him, leaving Tula and Gretchen alone in the tangle of roots. Tears spilled over Tula's eyes as she turned to face Gretchen. "You think you can get them back? I know what it's like to have someone dear to you go missing." She reached over and ran a finger along her cheek. "It's been too long for me to find anything more than bones, but I'll make it my business to get the living out first." Tula sniffled and dabbed at her cheeks with a handkerchief from her sleeve. With a few calming breaths, she closed her eyes and gave her wings a sharp flutter. "I think I know where they may be holding them." Gretchen waited for the fairy to collect her thoughts and rummaged around in her pouch for a potion to take the edge off the pain. She took a healthy swig, lamenting the lack of anti-inflammatory tonics. Her eye had swollen enough to narrow her vision, but that could be a problem for later. She wasn't looking forward to explaining her black eye to the regulars over at the Salton Bog. They have a network all over this world. Their citadel is the heart of its operations. But to feed, they keep sticky webs all across the forest to snare unsuspecting creatures. There is a waterfall some young ones dare each other to visit. I found the spider who made the ransom near its base. I'm assuming the top is well lit. Gretchen rubbed the light charms at her belt. The edge of our realm, our primary water source. Gretchen smacked her lips and nodded. "Well, at least that gives me a chance to take flight someplace clear, even if it is over the edge of a cliff. You think the youngsters are close by? The Arachne may steer clear of our lights, but they keep strongholds outside our borders." Tula swallowed. "Just in case." Gretchen pushed herself to her feet, her limbs already tingling from the potion. Figuring they'd have to make their way on foot, she stowed her broom in her pouch and fastened it to her belt. "The waterfall is some distance away," Tula pursed her lips, "but I think we may have something that may help." Gretchen allowed the fairy to usher her back to the path they arrived by, suspicion rising in her belly. The chatter of an unseen audience followed them along the trail, and Gretchen gave up trying to spot them after nearly tripping over a log. "So, you going to clue me in here? If there's something more efficient than tramping through these woods, maybe we should get it going before I twist an ankle." Tula shot a grin over her shoulder. "Greggen may not care if I fly out to my death, but he would have an apoplexy if he saw me waste so much fairy dust." Gretchen's eyes boggled, and she picked up her pace to keep up. She didn't relish the idea of smacking into any more tree branches, but didn't like her chances of a successful takeoff on her broom either. Their escort began to show themselves as they moved through the increasingly dense forest, then zipped ahead. While the lights had dulled since leaving the larger trees, toward their right seemed to glow brighter than the rest of the forest. Tula followed Gretchen's gaze. "The fairy dust production line. I have some friends who agreed to give me their quota." Gretchen recalled what Estelle had said about overpopulation. "So, the teeth business has tight margins." "Things are getting tenuous." Tula pressed her lips together. "We used to access other realms, but the portals are disappearing." Gretchen blinked. "You don't control them." "No, they just are." As Gretchen mulled that over, she stubbed her toe on a rock and cursed. "When is dawn likely to break?" "Dawn?" Tula came to a stop midair and swung around. "You really know nothing about this place, do you? We live in eternal twilight." Gretchen slowed, craning her head to see past the canopy and wiping sweat from her brow. From their position, the purple sky was completely obscured, and the lights which bobbed among the branches threw colour out of perspective. Now who would want to do that? How does it even work? This place is hot and sticky. Tula looked ahead to her companions and shook her head. Taking a seat on a branch, she took a deep breath, and Gretchen could almost see the cogs in her head turning. The caves in your realm? They're connected to similar caverns here, full of hot air from underground lava streams. We arrived here through the portals many years ago as refugees. Some say our old world was bright and sunny, but we brought little from that place, and even its proper name is lost. She paused. The Arachne have grown in numbers since we have been here. Their reach has widened, and with it, the light drains from the sky. It places a heavier burden on our resources. Gretchen tried to digest her crash course in fairy realm history and took in her surroundings. It all looked the same, tree size aside. So, is this entire place covered in trees? Yes, we don't have those. Seas like in your realm. Collecting teeth from a floating wooden box in the middle of the night is no trifle, you know. Yeah, I could imagine. Gretchen rubbed her chin. Was there ever a time when we, mingled over here? When these portals were a two-way street? Tula shrugged. I'm young by fairy standards. We grow up reciting the treaty and being trained on how to move between the worlds. The last of the portals to other realms closed before I started harvesting. The notion of how Gretchen's spellbook had come to know about this place niggled at her, but she doubted there were any apparent answers. Puffing out her cheeks, she ran a hand along her ribs and gave her pouch a pat. All right. We don't have all twilight to stand around yammering. I've got an explosion I'm not sure even an infinity pouch could contain rolling around among my stores. Tula called out something incomprehensible in a shrill shout, and her companions came into view, carrying something flat between them. Gretchen blinked as they drew near, and the shape came into focus. It looked like some kind of shield, or maybe a short canoe, and her eyebrows furrowed as she realised what they planned to do with it. I was never much good at those ski things back home. You can sit on it, if you wish. Tula flew over to assist the fairies who were sprinkling illuminated fairy dust all over her unfamiliar vehicle. It will be me steering, anyway. I hope you're a little more discerning than your friends who got me down that tree, Gretchen muttered. The shield gave a little lurch, the dust now invisible on its surface, though the wood seemed to glow. The fairies buzzed backwards, and Tula gave a wave of her hand. It lifted to hover around knee-height, and Tula arched an eyebrow at Gretchen, who gave the shield a nudge with her leg. It bobbed in the air, but slowed to rest with a faint hum. Well, I guess those toboggajiggers back home didn't look so bad. Gretchen swallowed as she eased her backside down on the shield, alarmed at how it sagged underneath her weight. It returned to an equilibrium, and she gingerly swung her legs up and settled herself as comfortably as she could, gripping both edges. You ready? There was a mischievous glint in Tula's eye, and she didn't wait for confirmation before zipping off into the trees ahead. Gretchen clamped a hand to her hat as the fairy towed her along, gritting her teeth against the likelihood of a head-on collision with a tree. She heard a chorus of cheering from behind her and checked herself before swinging around lest she upset her balance entirely. The ride was both exhilarating and terrifying. As Tula wove her way around tree trunks and ascended further from the forest floor, branches became dense, and Gretchen had to curl over her legs to avoid them. While a witch's gut was fortified after years of scooting around on brooms, this was something else entirely. They zigzagged across the forest at breakneck speed, both up and down and side to side. Somewhere in the back of her mind, Gretchen wondered at how Tula could be so precise given their relative sizes. When they broke from the trees, Gretchen sat up and sniffed. Moisture. She looked down to confirm they were travelling along a river, this part well lit. Tula slowed as the swells of water ahead turned to nothing, and Gretchen fumbled at both her hat and belt to activate her light charms. Tula flew out over the precipice and turned lazy circles downward as Gretchen caught up. She glanced down along the waterfall. It looked awfully dark down there. Chapter 7. Shh! Tula held a hand up, and Gretchen clicked her teeth shut. They may have an aversion to light, but their hearing is just fine. Gretchen swallowed and stared into the dense forest. The river behind them reflected some purple gloom from the sky, but even that was a small comfort as she imagined those spiders sneaking up on them from the shadows. Tula pushed ahead before Gretchen could protest, and she held a hand to her stomach against the lurch. They progressed a little slower, and Tula was careful not to disrupt the overhanging branches. It took some time for Gretchen's eyes to adjust to the sharp contrast between enchanted lights and the darkness surrounding them. They travelled in silence until Gretchen hissed as she spotted a faint blue line up ahead. A web, by the looks. The single line broke into different pathways, interconnecting as they swept upward into the trees. Gretchen pushed away the sour feeling in her belly as they drew near, imagining movement between the trees. Tula came to a stop before they got too close and sniffed at the air hesitantly. "I can't smell them," she whispered, "but that doesn't mean they aren't close by." Her nose twitching, Gretchen climbed off her levitating seat and tiptoed toward the first strand anchored to the ground. The light from her charms seemed to shrink as she got nearer, replaced by the eerie blue glow, which radiated a cold so different from the muggy air. As thick as one of her arms, the strand seemed crystalline and twisted on itself much like rope. Swallowing, she reached out to touch it and braced for something to go horribly wrong. When it didn't, she ran her fingers along the glassy surface with a chuckle. She gave it a tap with her fingernail and turned to Tula when she heard it. A hum rang out along the strand, getting louder as the movement reverberated up and down. Gretchen took a few steps forward and stopped short when a large shape dropped to the forest floor between her and Tula. She stared up at what she suspected was a spider's rear end, and her muscles bunched in fear. When Tula had said giant spiders, she'd thought perhaps something the size of a dog. The long hairy legs on this creature had to be as long as Gretchen herself. It began making clicking noises in Tula's direction, though Gretchen could understand what the creature said inside her mind. "You bring me a whole witch instead! You must want those imps back terribly to go to such trouble. Too bad they have already been sucked dry." Tula's cries pierced Gretchen's soul, and she snapped back into action, fumbling at her belt. One of her light charms came free, and she shook the small bottle to brighten its glow. The spider skittered on the spot to face her, its pincers looming above Gretchen's face. With a panicked shriek, she flicked the cork from the potion with her thumb and threw the bottle into the spider's face, hoping to distract it long enough to get the bomb out of her pouch. She stumbled backwards, fumbling at the laces, and the spider drew its legs close, hissing and stumbling from side to side. Steam began wafting from its face, and Gretchen's mouth hung open as she watched a simple light potion melt away its pincers. Flickering her gaze to Tula only long enough to find a path toward her, she sidestepped around the agonized spider to join the fairy who'd pressed herself against a trunk, tears streaming down her little cheeks. The fumes hung in a thick cloud, and Gretchen curled her lip at the smell. As tendrils of gloop hit the ground, sparks ignited the leaf mould, and Gretchen got as close as she dared to stamp out the flames. A forest fire wouldn't give them the anonymity they needed, and she was wary of the commotion drawing unwanted attention. He said they can't be, but if they are... Tula drew ragged breaths. "My little Angus and Tilly, I can't have done all this for nothing." Gretchen pressed her lips together and laid a finger on the fairy's shoulder. "I wouldn't have believed a word of it from the start, but now, especially. They may have had no intention of returning your kids, but I wouldn't trust their word about your kids perishing either." "Do you really think so?" Tula sniffled. "I've got plenty of spiders back home. They do a decent job of keeping flies out of my pantry, but I can tell you those flies don't die quickly. I don't know what kind of shape your youngsters will be in when we find them, but we can't give up now." Tula swallowed, her eyes glassy, and gave a tight nod. By then, the spider's body was a puddle on the ground, its legs curled uselessly around the pool. "What was in that potion?" "Regular light charm. Nothing that should have done that." Gretchen tapped a finger to her mouth. "Though I suppose the ingredients do have some crossover with insect repellents, and maybe the phosphorus in the guano had some kind of acidic reaction." "How many do you have?" Tula stared at the blue web strand. Gretchen patted down her belt and hat and located the other 3 charms. They didn't make her feel safe, exactly, but it was a comfort knowing she wasn't defenseless. "Enough. Now let's get moving." Rather than climbing back on the floating shield, Gretchen opted to use her feet for a while, following the outskirts of the web. Tula didn't protest and hovered behind her rather than leading the way. With no way to mark the time, Gretchen pushed away weariness and blinked to keep her wits about her as they spotted more blue glowing lines around them. They seemed to be heading in the right direction, and as the lines began intercrossing regularly, Gretchen stared up at the tree branches, waiting for an ambush from above. She swatted at her neck as she felt something tickle and cringed at the crawling sensation. Look, Tula pointed over her shoulder at a closely woven web in the vague shape of a beehive. One of their strongholds. Although it looked deserted, Gretchen was sure there must be some kind of presence in there. Muttering an incantation, she waved a hand over her light charms, which blinked out. She arched an eyebrow at Tula, who took a deep breath and toned her own glow down a notch or two. You can't go dark. Tula shook her head. This is the best I can do. Gretchen pursed her lips, mulling it over, and pulled her pointed hat from her head. In you get. Tula's lip curled, but she did as requested. Gretchen folded the hat over and tucked it carefully into her belt. Here goes nothing. She crept forward, mindful not to disturb the underbrush. The chorus of insects chirping seemed ridiculously loud in what looked like an abandoned forest. The distance between her and the hive had to be less than 200 yards, but it felt impossibly far, and she wasn't sure if the sweat trickling down her back had more to do with fear than humidity. As she stepped over a log, her heart stopped at the flicker of movement under her boot. She held her hand to her chest, heaving sharp breaths as she watched some kind of vermin scamper off. A muted squeak came from her hat, and she gave it a reassuring pat, not trusting her own voice to put Tula at ease. Glancing back, she couldn't see where the blue strand they followed began, and her mind struggled to reconcile the strange light and the scant distance they'd travelled. There could be anything out there, waiting for her to get closer. But if curiosity was good enough to kill a cat, she could at least understand where the cat in question was coming from. There were answers about Aunt Esme's demise in this realm. She could feel it in the marrow of her bones. She took another step forward, her eyes on the small opening at the bottom of the hive. As she got closer, it seemed to grow, and it stretched upward almost to the top of the canopy. Strands, seemingly from all angles, stretched away from its core, with small holes along the circular walls like tiny windows. When she stood in front of the entrance, she untied another light charm and turned it in her palm. She had to duck to get in, and craned her neck as she turned a circle, waiting for the attack. It didn't come, and she narrowed her eyes at the walls. Inside was dark, and what reflected from the walls was white, and not blue. Tula struggled at her belt, and she turned the fairy loose if only to get a better view. As Tula flew up in circles against their confines, Gretchen's eyes widened at the illuminated walls. Lumps bulged from the sides, and what looked like faces peered out, though Tula was moving too fast for Gretchen to get a good look. She lifted her light charm to her mouth and muttered an incantation, and as it flared, everything came into focus. Each bulge looked as though it were in a different state of decay, and Gretchen reached out to confirm what was holding them there. The sticky web was formidable, and she winced as she peeled the tip of her finger from the wall. "Do you see them?" Tula swooped down to hiss in her ear. "There could be hundreds in here." Gretchen strode around the walls holding her light aloft, staring at the faces closer to the ground. Some of them had decayed beyond recognition, and others shriveled into vague likenesses. Animals, some with fox-like faces, were pinned alongside tiny fairy ones. Gretchen strained to see the creatures further up. "The board," Tula pointed to the middle of the circular room, and Gretchen blinked at her makeshift vehicle levitating silently. She'd almost forgotten it after the spider incident. Reckoning with how much distance she'd need to take off on her broom, she sighed and crossed to the wooden platform to clamber aboard. It bobbed, then rose to meet Tula at the next level. Following along behind her, Gretchen stared at the faces she passed and hissed at Tula to slow as she buzzed along frantically. "If they're here, we'll find them." Tula paused and trembled mid-air, her face drained of all colour. She said nothing before taking off again, but at a pace more conducive to a thorough search. As they ascended, the bulges grew larger, and the faces more reminiscent of the living. Gretchen gasped when she saw a regular-sized face slumped over its bonds. "Stop!" Tula skidded to a halt and turned to the face in question, a twinge of annoyance flitting over her features. Gretchen leaned in closer, bile rising in her gut, and pulled out her broom to push the head back. Skin shrunk down to leather stretched over feminine cheekbones, and sparse hair broke off from the movement. Gretchen's eyes strained, trying to draw some semblance of recognition from the remains, but a sinking feeling told her this wasn't her Aunt Esme. "Head's too big," she muttered. Tula took that as her cue and zipped ahead, and as Gretchen lurched forward, the head broke from whatever was left of its body and clattered to the ground. Tula froze, and they both looked up, bracing themselves. After counting 10 heartbeats which threatened to explode from Gretchen's chest, she nodded to Tula. They glided on silently, resuming their search. Most of the spider's victims appeared to be the natural inhabitants of this world, with the odd fairy here and there. Gretchen hoped Tula wouldn't recognize any of them, and felt a stab of guilt at the notion of her coming face to face with her children in that state. As they neared the top, where a dome hung over them, the faces looked almost alive. She stared into the glassy eyes of what looked like a possum when Tula gave a pained shout. Before Gretchen could warn her off, she'd smacked into the wall, where 2 tiny lumps were stuck side by side. Although her wings beat frantically, she couldn't get herself unstuck. "Hush!" Gretchen tried to push herself forward to no avail. "Get me a little closer." Tula's cheek was fixed to the wall, but she looked to Gretchen from the corner of her eye, and her finger twitched. The platform drew nearer, and Gretchen reached into her pouch for a pair of scissors. Little Angus and Tilly were rigid, unresponsive, their eyes fixed straight ahead. "They won't help, you know." Gretchen swung around and held her light charm over the black abyss. Shadows flickered over the walls, and a witch, very much alive, regarded her over her own silken prison. Chapter 8. "They won't," Gretchen snipped at the air. "These shears have taken care of their fair share of sticky thorns." The witch chuckled, then winced, screwing her eyes shut. "I thought I'd die here without ever seeing another witch again." Gretchen glanced back at Tula, who obligingly flicked her fingers toward the far wall. Gretchen swallowed as she drew near to the captive, the light better illuminating her weathered face. "Tell me how to get you out of here." The witch gave a bitter laugh and winced. "You can't. There isn't much left of me under here. I'd turn to dust if you set me loose." That produced a squeak from the far wall, and Gretchen tensed. "The children, they haven't been here long." "They haven't, the poor sprites. Not in a good way, but if you got them out now." The witch pressed her lips together. They might come good. "Any ideas?" Gretchen reached into her pouch and pulled out a small flask of double-distilled witch's brew. She held it up to the witch's lips and waited for her to swallow it down. The witch gave an appreciative groan. "I've had a great deal of time to ponder the matter. Us witches don't get the mercy of being put into a deep freeze. The only thing I could come up with was fire." She coughed and squeezed her eyes shut. "I doubt even my spellbook could come up with a potion to dissolve this mess." Gretchen blinked, weighing up the options. Tula's pathetic moans grated across her mind, and her thoughts crept to her Aunt Esme. "How long have you been here? What's your name? Have you seen Esme Mirkwood?" The witch's eyelids dropped, and Gretchen cupped her cheek with a gentle shake. She flinched, and her eyes came into focus. "Florence Firebrace. Can't say I've heard of an Esme, but I recall there being some Mirkwoods in our family, twice removed on my mother's side. How long?" Gretchen tried to keep her tone gentle, but feared the answer wouldn't be what she wanted to hear. "Oh, I'd say a few months. Fancied a few of those cave lobsters for my tea. Wasn't the first time I'd been down that cave, but that time they were waiting for me." A few months. Aunt Esme had been missing for close to 3 years. Florence looked like she was holding on by a thread. "Let me try." Gretchen gritted her teeth and slid the shears under a layer of webs. As she clamped down, Florence shrieked in pain. "I'm done for, you hear me?" Her breath came in ragged gasps. "The only mercy you can give is that of the flames, like in the old days, scattered to the 4 winds." Gretchen fought back tears at the impossible choice and considered what she had in her pouch. She rummaged around and produced a vial of purple liquid. Florence sniffed at the air as Gretchen uncorked it. "Valerian root?" "Enough to put an elephant into a deep sleep," Gretchen snuffed. "Grown in my very own garden." Florence met her eyes, and her wasted face cracked in a wide grin. "Go on then, torch the entire nest." Gretchen held the bottle up to Florence's lips, and tears spilled down her cheeks. Once the bottle was empty, she ran a hand over the witch's brow and turned back to Tula. "If we're going to do this, we must be quick about it." Tula summoned the floating platform back across in sharp jerks, and Gretchen located her flamestone. It was warm in her sweaty palm, and her throat constricted at the prospect of getting this wrong. She drew a deep breath through her nose and leaned over to Tula's field of view. "Now I'm going to light a flame just underneath you and hope that the webs scorch quickly enough to rip you all free before, well, let's just hope this works." Closing her eyes and willing her stomach to quiet down, she uttered the words to ignite the stone. She held it to the side of the bulge, hoping for the web to peel away, and took a firm hold of Tula's shoulder. With a woof, the single flame turned into a wall of fire, and Gretchen wrenched Tula free. Tucking her under her belt so she couldn't interfere, she reached into her pointed hat and used it as a mitt to grasp the little bundles through the blackening web. Flames licked up to the roof, and by the time she'd gotten Angus free, acrid smoke had filled the enclosed space. Tula writhed and squealed in outrage from her pinned position, and the platform shuddered. Less gentle with little Tilly, Gretchen feared she may have crumpled a wing as she stuffed her in the infinity pouch, while Tula lashed out. "Now, down!" The platform plummeted, and Gretchen had to hold on with both hands to keep from falling. Tula wormed her way free and buzzed around Gretchen's head. Through it all, Gretchen heard a sickening clatter. She saw the bulk of a spider through the smoke above, squeezing in through a hole on the wall. "Out!" Gretchen screamed. Tula skidded to a halt and cast around wildly. Aiming for a hole that seemed clear, she cannoned out, and Gretchen's platform caught momentarily against the edges. As it hit the crystalline blue thread outside, it shot upwards, grating along the surface. Risking a look behind her, Gretchen saw the hive swarming with spiders scuttling across the surface. But it was too late. Even now flames poured out of the upper holes and ignited sparks on the exterior. A wave of grief for poor Florence and all the other creatures entombed there threatened to overtake her, but the squalling from Tula refocused her attention. She flew alongside the platform, dodging branches, her face panicked, and Gretchen looked down to see her ride had connected to the strand. Try as she might, Tula couldn't beat her wings hard enough to get close. As the implications of riding a spider web settled in her mind, the grating sound took on an impending sense of doom. They cleared the tree line as the land sloped downward, and she reached into her pouch, mindful not to disturb her injured cargo, to pull her broom out. Tula's eyes widened, her arms held out as if to stop her, and Gretchen pointed to a spot ahead. A spider was racing toward them, fangs clicking over the wind. Pushing herself up into a crouch, she wobbled and gripped the broom handle like it was fixed to something solid. The spider was almost upon them, and she leapt sideways with a silent plea for her broom to save her skin. Although she didn't swing her broom in time to get her rump on top, it zoomed clear of the blue thread, and Gretchen held onto the handle for all she was worth. Her palms still sweaty, she slipped further down until she was hanging on by the bristles, her eyes screwed shut against the probability of a fatal fall. When it didn't come, and the broom slowed, she blinked her eyes open. Her broom took her on a downward trajectory, easing gently toward a rocky outcrop which jutted out from the forest canopy. Dumbstruck, she thought she may have hit her head somewhere along the line when her boots touched down to safety, and the broom hovered within her reach. "Well, I'll be," she mused. "Didn't think you had it in you." She ran a reverent hand along the broom's handle and jumped when Tula zipped past her field of view. "My children?" Tula pawed at Gretchen's belt. "Safe!" She swatted the fairy away. "Let me get them out." Dropping to the smooth rock, she reached into her pouch and pulled out her hat, with the sprites tucked inside. The singed smell wasn't promising, but as she laid it out, both Tilly and Angus lay in the fetal position, their little faces whole. Leaving Tula to sob over them, Gretchen fetched some burn salve and a tincture she hoped would relax their muscles. She hadn't dealt with paralysis before, but figured the potion couldn't hurt. With a gentle tap on Tula's shoulder, she pushed the salve toward her. "For the burns. Let them stay as they are until we can ease the pain." Tula nodded and set to work, leaving Gretchen to consider their surroundings. Forest stretched as far as she could see, marked by the illumination that divided the territories. The bright lights of the fairy stronghold seemed small compared to the crisscrossing of blue lines, and from her vantage she could see the centre of the web, with smaller surrounding points, which she figured were other hives. The forest fire they'd left behind seemed so small in comparison. Her aunt's remains could be in any one of those places, or maybe not there at all. "She moved!" Tula's voice shook. "Tilly, her fingers moved!" Gretchen smiled, bittersweet. "I'm sure they'll come out of this, just fine." She wasn't sure of that, but didn't want to dampen Tula's hopes. Eerie sounds reached them from the fire, and Gretchen couldn't shake the sense that she'd woken an entire colony of predators. They seemed too far from the safety of the fairy's domain for Gretchen's liking, and she looked to the closer treetops, imagining that an attack would arrive at any minute. "Come on, Tula, we can't stay here. Let's get them back in the pouch. I'll give you a ride back." Tula dragged her eyes from her children and stared past Gretchen at the blaze which blew sparks above the canopy. "And then? I'll never find her in here," Gretchen swallowed. "And if by some dumb luck I did, there'd only be bones left. There's only one thing I can do." She eyed the pouch on the ground. "I'm sorry. About your friend back there." Tula stroked Angus's little cheek absently. "If we weren't stuck, you may have—" Florence was done for. Gretchen took a deep breath to hold her composure. "I put an end to her suffering. If I don't get the answers I need out of this, the least I can do is extend the same mercy to any other witches strung up in those hives." Tula turned her attention back to the children and peeled off their scorched clothes with a wince to lather them with salve. Gretchen fetched strips of clean linen to wrap them in. Once they'd gotten the children back into Gretchen's pouch, Tula reached out to clasp a finger. "I don't know how I can thank you for all of this. Tell you what, next time I have a sore tooth, you can come and fix it up for me." Tula broke into a grin and sprang into the air. With another stroke along the broom handle, Gretchen settled herself on her subdued vehicle and leaned forward to get moving. They took to the air, moving away from the smoke haze toward Tula's home. When they arrived above the well-lit canopy, Gretchen puzzled over how to get the children down. Before she could ask, the fairy zipped off under the canopy and returned after a few minutes with a group of guards chattering fiercely among themselves. Gretchen retrieved her hat and bundled the children carefully into the waiting nets. "There's likely to be a forest fire," Gretchen warned. "Have your people ready to protect your lands." Tula nodded. "We have magical wards for that purpose." Their eyes locked, and before Tula could say anything, Gretchen sped off into the twilight. She'd never been one for pyrotechnics, but as she stared down at the map of webs underneath her, it seemed she should try to take out the other hives first. After proving they were susceptible to fire, she had a few ideas on how to go about torching them. Rummaging about for her flask, she took a small sip for courage and tugged at the wrapped linen bundles she kept among her medicinals. Steering toward the closest hive, she doused the first bundle and readied the flamestone. It took a level of coordination she didn't possess, and a good measure of foolhardiness she had in abundant supply, but she swooped down to the canopy to drop the first fire starter. Thanking her lucky stars and her Aunt Esme for guiding her path, she let out a whoop as she veered back up again and onto the next. She didn't know how long it took to make her way around the intricate web, or if there were others she was missing further out, but as smoke permeated her senses, she coughed and reached into her pouch for the last drop. Despite the haze, the light bomb sparkled in her hands, and her mouth twisted in a grin as she began her downward trajectory. The spider citadel was crawling with its inhabitants, a writhing mess of legs clicking and hissing. Gretchen pushed away revulsion and clamped down on the fear of spiders dragging her from her perch. Her broom cannoned downward, its speed entirely of its own volition, and Gretchen counted her heartbeats, waiting for the opportune time, the seconds grinding almost to a halt. Then everything happened at once. She felt a drag on the back of her broom and turned to see a spider trying to get purchase, dangling from the bristles. She dropped the light bomb and pulled a charm from her belt. A leg brushed against hers, and she slid further up the handle. There was a blast, and the broom pivoted sharply in the air. Gretchen uncorked the light charm with her teeth and dropped it on the spider's head. It didn't let go, and Gretchen swung her leg around to kick at its clicking fangs. Flames burst into the sky underneath them, and the broom shot sideways, almost upsetting Gretchen, but dislodging the screeching arachne. She watched as it disappeared in the wall of flames and held tight to her broom as it carried her higher. From far above, Gretchen considered the damage. The centre of the web was an inferno, and the blue strands had turned bright red as they singed to nothing. Most of the hives had caught fire, and the ones that escaped the flames had red embers travelling their way. Gretchen had a gash on her leg, which only throbbed when she noticed the blood trickling down. Blinking, her eyes adjusted to the brightness, and she looked upward in confusion. The purple twilight was different, not so dark, getting brighter before her eyes. Up ahead, a glimmer signalled the location of a portal. Holding the broomstick with both hands in a wave of dizziness, she aimed straight for it and her broom obliged, carrying her from the fairy realm and back into a bright blue sky. With a ragged gasp, she leaned over, trusting her broom to carry her safely back to her cottage. She got the feeling that once she landed, she'd be in for a world of hurt. But that wasn't anything new. Gretchen eased into her favourite armchair with a groan, every inch of her body feeling battered and bruised. With a strong cup of tea and a cold compress for her leg, she decided to put her feet up, before doing a full inventory of her injuries. She'd expected her living room to be trashed after Nora's mishap with the portal, but her friend must have cleared up after she departed with Tula. Fairies. Gretchen hoped Tula's little munchkins were okay. Mulligan leaped into Gretchen's lap, and she gave her furry friend a scratch behind the ear. "Nice to see you too, Fleabag." After he settled into a ball, Gretchen leaned her head back and closed her eyes. She supposed the brightening sky of the fairy realm meant the spider's hold on the atmosphere had dwindled and hoped that boded well for the fairies. With the network of webs in ruins, perhaps their need for fairy lights to protect their territory wouldn't be so cumbersome. In the quiet aftermath of her journey, Gretchen reflected on what she'd learned about portals and caves. Tula said they'd been closing, and that the fairies themselves had no power over them. It was worth a look in the library at the academy. There was a reckoning to be had with her sister over the whole sordid affair, and Gretchen knew she'd better go well informed to that war of words. But if the portals had been closing... Gretchen sat up bolt upright and Mulligan sprang off her lap. Maybe Aunt Esme hadn't met her end in one of those hives at all. That old duck was wilier than most, and if there was any witch who could have sprung herself out of a spider prison, it was her. Gretchen's heart pounded in her chest, but she was grinning from ear to ear. She wouldn't write off her aunt just yet, not until she'd done a little portal hopping herself. Thank you for joining me on this magical journey through Witch's Teeth, Episode 4 of the Gretchen's Misadventures series. If you've been captivated by Gretchen's quirky escapades, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more enchanting readings and fantastical tales. Share your thoughts on this bewitching misadventure, or recommend your favourite fantasy reads in the comments below. Your insights are the magic that keeps this community thriving. If you're ready for more Gretchens and her magical escapades, give this video a thumbs up and hit the notification bell to stay updated on all things magical. Until our next adventure, may your books be filled with wonder and your days with magic. Happy reading!